In a review of his work undertaken for a bibliographic exercise in 1989, Gilles Deleuze classified the first period of his publications under the general theme From Hume to Bergson. What transpires in this move from Deleuze's first publication, Empiricism and Subjectivity, an essay on Hume's theory of human nature from 1953, to his second substantial text, the essay Bergson's Conception of Difference, published 3 years later? First and foremost, as the title of the Bergson essay suggests, it's the move from Hume to Bergson we encounter a certain genesis of Deleuze's thinking of difference. And in order to make sense of what's taking place in this genesis, we need to understand the problematic to which the genesis constitutes a response. And what Craig and I are going to propose is that Deleuze develops his thinking of difference in response to a philosophical problematic which is determined by the principle of sufficient reason. Empiricism and Subjectivity was a revised edition of a version of Deleuze's Diplôme d'études supérieures on Hume, which he completed under the supervision of Hippolyte and Canguilhem in 1947. And it's to Hippolyte that the published work is dedicated. In the following year, Deleuze completes his Agrégation, which featured oral exams that year on Hume's inquiry concerning human understanding and Bergson's matter and memory. In 1952, Hippolyte publishes Logic and Existence, a text which will have far-reaching consequences for French philosophy and the reception of Hegel in particular. Deleuze, in what is now a well-known text, a short review dating from 1954, the same year in which he presented the first version of Deleuze's conception of difference Bergson's conception of difference to the Society of Friends of Bergson, a group which Deleuze was introduced to by Hippolyte. In his review, Deleuze offers indications towards two significant issues with which he was grappling in the period in which he moves from Hume to Bergson. And these arise from a fundamental claim that, quote, philosophy must be ontology. It cannot be anything else. The two issues are that there can be no ontology of essence, which is very close, I think, to what you've just been telling us, Florian, and that philosophy cannot be anthropology. Deleuze clarifies this latter claim in the following way, quote, anthropology aspires to be a discourse on humanity. As such, it proposes the empirical discourse of humanity. Reflection is on one side, being is on the other. Subjectivity is thus treated as a fact, and anthropology will be set up as the science of this fact, end quote. What will be most striking about Deleuze's reading of Hume's empiricism is how he illuminates the way in which the becoming of the subject, and more specifically how the mind becomes a subject, is the problem that determines Hume's philosophy. We'll show that Deleuze interprets the becoming of a subject as a process of individuation. And furthermore, how this process of individuation expresses what Deleuze will call, in his reading of Hume, a principle of difference. Whilst it can be shown that such a principle of difference may be discernible in the letter of Hume's text, and while it's also possible to conceive the principle of difference as being congruent with what Hume calls the principles of human nature, an implication of Deleuze's reading is that Hume offers no resources for conceiving difference itself as having a nature. This is because, we are going to suggest, difference remains an external relation in Hume's philosophy and therefore cannot be thought in itself. This takes us to the other issue which Deleuze articulates in the review essay on Hippolyte, where he writes, quote, in the empirical, external difference of thought and being has given way to difference which is identical to being, to the internal difference of being that thinks itself. In his review essay, Deleuze makes it clear that Hippolyte's own response to the internal difference of being that thinks itself reveals his, quote, Hegelian bias. Being can be identical to difference only insofar as difference is taken to the absolute, in other words, all the way to contradiction. The problem for Deleuze, then, is how to think being as difference without difference reducing to contradiction. Quote, one might wonder whether an ontology of difference couldn't be created that would not go all the way to contradiction, since contradiction would be less than, not more than, difference. We're going to argue that because Hume's empiricism doesn't offer the means for thinking the nature of difference in itself, Deleuze turns to Bergson in the search for a notion of internal difference that is able to yield being. In addition, Deleuze will show how the method by which this is achieved, Bergson's method of intuition, also retains a differential basis for thinking individuation, which Deleuze had already delineated in Hume. Most importantly, Deleuze's pursuit of these two elements, the conception of internal difference and the method for articulating individuation, will involve charting a course between the beacons of Humean empiricism and transcendental analysis, resulting in Deleuze's superior empiricism, a phrase which he later adapts to transcendental empiricism. Eschewing the Kantian strategy of establishing the conditions for all possible experience, Deleuze's turn to Bergsonism will lead to an investigation of the conditions of real experience. In this context, ontology is no longer founded or determined by essence. With Bergsonism, quote, the ground is experienced. The nature of being as such is to be reached via this experience and that experience, or more specifically, this subject's experience of this being's being. The driving questions then become, how are we to differentiate between and individuate this being or that being? But also, how does a subject come to be identified as this subject, and thus differentiated from that subject? In other words, how can we come to know the sufficient reason for the being of each subject and each thing? It's in this way that it turns out that Deleuze's early work comes to be animated by the problem of sufficient reason. And in making this claim, we're aiming to develop a reading of Deleuze which achieves two interrelated methodological aims. First, in what we might characterize as a methodologically genetic reading or productive reading, thinking back to Spinoza, we're seeking to show how the emergence of the ontology of difference and differential individuation in Deleuze's earliest works are framed by an engagement with the problem of sufficient reason. The other thing we're doing is we're explicitly setting our reading against a dominant, or what we call in our paper, a canonical reading, which reads these early texts on sufficient reason back through difference and repetition, and more specifically through Leibniz, and sees these works always already as an anticipation of Deleuze's engagement with Leibniz. And what we're wanting to say is that this is already there in these texts before Deleuze is reading Leibniz, before he's thinking about Leibniz. And in a sense, we would almost want to say that the way he responds to Leibniz is a consequence of how he has framed this problematic in these earliest texts. So that's a little bit of kind of Deleuze pointy-headedness, I guess. Okay. Hume. And the reason I'm giving you this handout is there's going to be some Humean concepts, and I want to give you a sort of visual sense of how these concepts relate to each other, a kind of spatial rendition of their individuation in relation to each other. Hume presents an explicit critique of the principle of sufficient reason early in the treatise, based on his skeptical arguments regarding causality. These arguments undermine what Hume says is the general maxim in philosophy that whatever begins to exist must have a cause. If we can imagine an object existing or coming into existence without some prior cause or productive principle, Hume says, then we must admit that we cannot prove the impossibility, quote, that anything can ever begin to exist without some productive principle. For Deleuze, however, there's a more significant argument against the principle of sufficient reason, which gestures towards the fundamental philosophical problematic of Humean empiricism. If the empiricist holds that our knowledge can only begin with the data of sensory experience, then, with respect to any putative principle of sufficient reason, it seems that there could be nothing which is itself given within the manifold of our sensory experience that could explain how or why our experiences are given in the way that they're experienced. As Hume writes, we must restrict our speculations to the appearance of objects to our senses without entering into disquisitions regarding their real nature and operation. How should we understand this manifold of sensory experience which defines the ground of Hume's empiricism? Hume begins from from the perspective of Bergsonism, we might call a multiplicity. This multiplicity consists of impressions comprising, and I'm now sort of looking at the handout, you can track through here, comprising perceptual impressions, emotions, the sensations of the primary passions, instincts such as hunger, lust, etc. In addition to the impressions, there are ideas, which are copies of the perceptual impressions, thoughts, memories, meanings, imaginings, and there are secondary passions, emotions, desires, which can be both direct and indirect. These atomic elements that comprise the mind arise and pass away in constant flux. Deleuze underscores that impressions and ideas don't, strictly speaking, occur in the mind, as if the mind were a faculty that pre-exists these data of experience, but rather that the mind, quote Deleuze, is identical to ideas in the mind. And in a famous passage from the treatise, just a fabulous piece of writing, to which Deleuze returns, understandably, on frequent occasions, Hume writes that the mind is nothing other than a bundle or collection of different perceptions which succeed each other in a perpetual flux and movement. Nor is there any single power of the soul which remains unalterably the same. The mind is a kind of theatre where several perceptions successively make their appearance, pass, repass, glide away. There's no simplicity in it, nor identity in different. But the comparison of the theatre mustn't mislead us, Hume says. There are successive perceptions only that constitute the mind, nor have we the most distant notion of the place where these scenes are represented. That's what Hume says, which corresponds to what you're saying about the idea of no extra space in which these things take place. It's just the relations between them. As Deleuze writes, impressions and ideas comprise a collection without an album, a play without a stage. The place is not different from what takes place within it. The representation does not take place in a subject. There are no connections at this stage between the multiplicity of impressions and ideas other than chance connections brought about by the imagination, a kind of indeterminate chaos. And this is why Deleuze describes the multiplicity as being indeterminate. Hume shouldn't be understood as implying that the imagination connects ideas with something like the agency of a faculty. It's not, as Deleuze writes, a determining determination. At this stage, such connectings, these chaotic connections, are brought about by the imagination without constancy and without uniformity. But as Deleuze claims, the imagination itself is something determinable. This determinability occurs because the imagination comes to be affected by what Hume calls principles of association, principles which are themselves part of the wider set of the principles of human nature. And I think that this is Deleuze's great contribution to the history of scholarship, of Hume's scholarship, that he has identified this concept of the principles of human nature in its various ramifications as being the most significant conceptual theme in Hume's thought. So what does Hume mean when he talks about principles of association? What are these principles, Deleuze asks? Although Hume offers no definition of principles, he does write of his aims in the treatise that in seeking to explain the principles of human nature, we in effect propose a complete system of the sciences, and that he is seeking to explain, quote, the ultimate principles of the soul. In the context of the principles of association, Hume talks of a gentle force by which our ideas are connected. And it seems clear that what he has in mind here is something very close to what Newton talks about when he describes gravity as a gentle force. and there are a number of clues to follow that show that Hume has Newton very much in mind as he's setting this up. Whilst Deleuze offers no definition of the notion of principles in empiricism and subjectivity, there's a lecture course on Hume which he delivers just a few years later in 1957 to 1958, which has been recently published. And there, Deleuze also echoes Newtonian mechanics when he writes, quote, that the principles are laws, in other words, constant rules for certain effects. They refer to effects, not causes. A little later, he goes further. The principles make us pass from one idea, they make us pass from one idea to another. Taken together, and by interweaving a certain mechanics of force, they make us pass, with the force of law, principles are constant rules. These definitions offer a hint as to how Deleuze might be construing Humean principles as principles of sufficient reason. And if we're correct in making this assumption, then it's notable that Deleuze stresses that principles refer to effects, not causes, because that circumvents Hume's critique of the principle of human reason, which refers to causes but not effects. So the principles of association that affect the imagination and render it determinable are of three kinds. Principles of resemblance, like ideas connect with other like ideas. Contiguity, in time and in place, the ideas of impressions that occur successively in time, for instance, with one another, and most famously of causality. So when the imagination is affected by these principles of association, the association of ideas, the way in which the mind passes from one idea to another, is no longer random, it's no longer chaotic, but begins to develop a coherence, a constancy. And in this way, Deleuze argues, imagination becomes a faculty. And in turn, the process by which the imagination acquires a constancy and a nature is itself the first stage in the process by which the mind becomes a subject. From the very first pages of Empiricism and Subjectivity, Deleuze argues that the question of how the mind becomes a subject is the determining, defining problem for Humean empiricism. Despite this problematic representing the central theme of the book, though, it's not straightforwardly the case that for Deleuze, the essence of empiricism is located in the specific problem of subjectivity. The more fundamental problem, he writes, is how a subject transcending the given can be constituted in the given. The problem of how the mind is able to go beyond the given amounts to reasoning about causes and effects. Imagination on its own isn't able to achieve this. The most that imagination can do is to accomplish the regularity of the repetition of certain similar cases. X then Y, X then Y, X then Y. But going beyond repetition of the given would consist in inferring a Y that is yet to come from an X that we're currently experiencing, or an X that has happened in the past from a Y that we are currently experiencing. Quote Deleuze, the faculty of drawing conclusions from experience and also of transcending experience and making inferences, namely the understanding, must therefore be derived from a principle other than that of association. The imagination is determinable by the principles of association, but the mind becomes a subject when it's determined to act, when it's activated, Deleuze writes. And subjectivity then is determined as an effect, and it is, Deleuze says, in effect, an impression of reflection. So that Hume's discussion of impressions of reflection is very, very short, happens earlier in the book, and Deleuze goes a long way to articulating what's at stake in this concept. For Hume, the impressions of perception and sensation are primary because they're originary. They are the immediate data of experience. By contrast, impressions of reflection, such as the emotions, the passions, and desires, are secondary. We have an impression, a sensation of pleasure or pain, or of a pleasurable object or a painful object. An idea is formed, a copy, which is the copy of the impression that remains after the impression passes away. Then, when the idea of that pleasure or pain returns, quote Hume, it produces new impressions, impressions of desire and aversion, hope and fear, and these may probably be called impressions of reflection, because they are derived from the sensations. So the impressions of reflection are in turn copied as ideas by the memory and by imagination, becoming ideas which in turn may give rise to further impressions and ideas. So Deleuze glosses this really condensed argument in Hume when he says, we speak of an impression of reflection whenever the necessary relation is the mind affected and determined in certain circumstances by the idea of an object to form the idea of another object. And in this way, Deleuze concludes the proper role of the impressions of reflection, being effects of the principles of human nature, is to qualify in various ways the mind as a subject. In qualifying the mind, the impressions of reflection provide dispositions of the mind. I should do this. I need to do this. This is what I must do. That is determinations for acting. And in doing so, they subjectify or individuate the mind. I am the one who does this. This is what I do. This is my way of behaving. These impressions of reflection, however, are themselves effects of principles, but not principles of association. Hume calls these the principles of the passions. Quote Deleuze, the effect of the principle of the passions is always an impression of reflection. On Deleuze's reading, the impressions of reflection enable the mind to transcend the given. But there is nothing transcendental in the given. Rather, transcendence, the going beyond of the given, is itself given to the mind. But, Deleuze says, in an altogether different sense and manner, it is given as practice, as an affection of the mind, and as an impression of reflection. Empirical subjectivity, the actuality of this individuated subject, is constituted in the mind under the influence of the principles of the passions are affecting it. So if the principles of association give the mind a consistency, the principles of the passions give the mind, the subjectified mind, a consistency of belief, a dispositional quality, and thereby a consistency in acting. Hume characterizes the principles of the passions, therefore, as habit and custom. And under the influence of the principles of association and the principles of the passions in conjunction, the subjectified, determined mind, quote Deleuze, pursues a goal or an intention. It organizes means in view of an end. Thus, the collection, the indeterminate multiplicity with which we started, becomes a system. And then a longer quote. We see that in all cases, the subject is presented in the mind under the influence of two kinds of combined principles. Everything takes place as if the principles of association provide the subject with its necessary form, whereas the principles of the passions provide it with its singular content. The latter function, then, as the principle for the individuation of the subject. The principles of association make consistent relations between ideas possible, and in doing so they give a form to thinking. They explain, for example, the shared notions of good sense that are to be found amongst members of human communities, often in their public spaces. Nonetheless, the principles of association don't account for the difference between one mind and another, between one subject and another. In other words, they can't account for the individuation of subjects. In order to understand individuation, the, quote Deleuze, specific progress, i.e. the genesis of a mind, must be studied. Why, in this mind, does this perception evoke this particular idea and lead to us acting in this particular way, rather than any other way or any other idea? And by way of an answer to this question, Deleuze cites Hume. relation should be defined as that particular circumstance in which, even upon the arbitrary union of two ideas in fancy, we may think proper to compare them. It's the specific circumstances, the history, the geography, all the elements of the relations, all the elements that comprise the subject matter for the social theorists among Hume's contemporaries in the Scottish Enlightenment that come to define our passions and interests, that come to determine our specific subjectivity and thus individuate us. And this is why Deleuze concludes that for Hume, circumstance gives the relation its sufficient reason. And so we arrive at a principle of sufficient reason in Deleuze's Hume. And this might seem like a curious outcome, because as we've seen, Hume provides an explicit critique of the principle of sufficient reason. But as it turns out, it's in the aid of articulating the genesis of individuation that both the critique of one principle and the positing of another is advanced. To demonstrate this, let's return to Hume's point of departure. Empiricism begins with the given. The challenge is to account for why experiences are given in the way that they are given. Transcendental philosophy responds to this challenge by situating itself, quote Deleuze, on a methodologically reduced plane that provides an essential certainty, a certainty of essence. In contrast, the response of Hume's empiricism is prosecuted from a purely immanent point of view that doesn't presuppose the constitution of a subject. Quote Deleuze, the given is no longer given to a subject. Rather, the subject constitutes itself in the given. Hume's merit lies in the singling out of this empirical problem in its pure state and in its separation from the transcendental and from the psychological. Here we can already see the makings of what will become Deleuze's celebrated distinction between the Kantian search for conditions of all possible experience and, at this stage, Humean insistence on the conditions of real experience. And what is it that is given? Quote Deleuze, "It is, says Hume, the flux of the sensible, a collection of impressions and images, or a set of perceptions. We use the terms imagination and mind not to designate a faculty or a principle of organization, but rather a particular set or a particular collection." This is empiricism's principle, its constitutive principle, namely, everything separable is distinguishable and everything distinguishable is different. This is, Deleuze concludes, Humean empiricism's principle of difference. It follows that experience is a constitutive succession of difference, which is to say, quote, the movement of separable ideas insofar as they are different and different insofar as they're separable. Empiricism, Deleuze continues, must begin with this experience because it is the experience. It doesn't presuppose anything else, and nothing else precedes it. The principle of difference that Deleuze finds in Hume, therefore, is much more than just a principle. It's a method that is to coordinate with the principle of sufficient reason, not only because it demands that one begin with this experience rather than that, but also because it responds to the question of how this subject comes to be the subject that it is, how this subject differs from that subject. In other words, the problem of individuation expressed through a process of differentiation. Furthermore, this principle and method are not at odds with Hume's critique of the principle of sufficient reason, for what that critique specifically pertained to was the presupposition of subjects and the capacity of the given to transcend itself. Deleuze has implied that Hume's principles of human nature are therefore grounded in a more fundamental principle. He says, at a crucial point in the book, the fundamental principle of empiricism is the principle of difference. Would we be correct on the basis of this claim in proposing that the principle of difference amounts to Humean empiricism's principle of sufficient reason? If so, it would amount to claiming that the principles of human nature by which the mind comes to be qualified as a specific subject are principles of differentiation. What defines the multiplicity of impressions and ideas, the ground of Hume's empiricism? Solely that each element of the multiplicity is an element to the extent that it's different from all the others. There's no simplicity in it, nor identity in the different. What defines the end of Hume's philosophy, namely the question of why this subject acts in this way? It's a matter of the outcome of a genetic process of differentiation, individuation. But we can also propose a further final point. If our interpretation of Deleuze's reading is justified, the reading of Hume is justified, then what we've delineated is a first outline of a philosophical project. How might it be possible to develop a philosophy in which difference functions as a principle of sufficient reason? And this project will achieve its first full articulation in Deleuze's reading of Bergson, which is first presented 1 year after the publication of the book on Hume, but then only published 2 years later. Why does Deleuze need to move from Hume to Bergson in order to develop this project in which difference functions as a principle of sufficient reason? Even if Deleuze is correct in proposing a principle of difference as a constitutive principle for Hume's empiricism, it remains the case for Hume that difference functions as an external relation between ideas. Even if, as we've suggested, individuation is a process of differentiation, Hume's empiricism doesn't offer the conceptual resources for thinking this differentiation on the basis of difference in itself, or for thinking the nature of difference. As we'll see, the whole trajectory of Deleuze's reading of Bergson in 1956 is determined by the imperative of thinking difference in itself and in its difference from difference as negation. But we'll also see, in the course of this trajectory, the problems of sufficient reason and individuation will be taken up anew, but this time with a new principle and a new method of difference that's capable of circumventing the aporia that remains for Deleuze's Hume. And that's what Craig's going to tell you about now.
Okay, thanks, Robin. Right, so I'll take up the baton now, and we're going to be shifting from, as Robin was just describing, Deleuze's early work on Hume to his work on Bergson. Okay. So Deleuze begins his essay Bergson's Conception of Difference by establishing difference as the context for his reading of Bergson. He will use the notion of difference to throw a certain light on Bergson's philosophy, and inversely outline how, he says, Bergsonism must bring the greatest contribution to the philosophy of difference, end quote. What's most interesting from the perspective of Deleuze's transition from Hume to Bergson is how this philosophy of difference will be framed in such a way that it is capable of addressing the problematics that remained unanswered in Deleuze's Hume, as well as in his review of Hippolyte's Logic and Existence, which Robbins referred to at the start. Deleuze writes, quote, "On the one hand, it is a matter of determining the differences of nature between things. It is only in this way that we will be able to return to things themselves, to account for them without reducing them to something other than themselves, to grasp them in their being. But on the other hand, if the being of things is, in a certain way, in their differences of nature, we can hope that difference itself is something, that it has a nature, finally, that it will deliver being to us," end quote. That's from the start of Bergson's Conception of Difference. Now, from these first sentences of the essay, we can already discern that Deleuze's philosophy of difference is concerned with the problem of reaching things themselves, in their being. Deleuze has already established that he will deploy Bergson's analysis of differences of nature to address this problem. He has also given away how the story will end, in a philosophy of difference that can deliver what Hegel, or more precisely Hippolyte's Hegel, could not, namely being and the nature of difference in itself. Of most relevance for our interpretation, however, is the observation that the problematic which frames Deleuze's Bergsonism is the problem, already delineated in his reading of Hume, of reaching things themselves and arriving at their sufficient reason. In the second paragraph of the essay, Deleuze goes so far as to suggest that this problem is tantamount to the aim of philosophy. He says, if philosophy is to have a positive and direct relation with things, it is only to the extent that it claims to grasp the thing itself in what it is, in its difference all that it is not, which is to say, in its internal difference. End quote. By way of justification for his recourse to this notion of internal difference, Deleuze argues that if two or more individuals of the same kind are to be distinct from one another, and not one and the same, there must be some kind of difference of nature between them, not just a difference of degree or merely a spatio-temporal difference. He says, we must effectively recognize that difference itself is not exterior or superior to the thing. And as the passage continues, he says, thus, either philosophy proposes this way and this aim for itself, differences of nature in order to arrive at internal difference, or else it will only have a negative and generic relation with things. It will end up as criticism or generality, in any case, in a merely external state of reflection. Placing himself within the first point of view, Bergson proposes the ideal of philosophy, to tailor for the object a concept appropriate to the object alone, a concept one can barely say is still a concept since it applies only to that one thing. The unity of the thing and the concept is internal difference, which is reached via differences of nature. End quote. Now, with the Hegelian schema of difference as negation, things remain defined by their external relations or differences from other things. Through Bergson, Deleuze discerns a positive alternative, a method for defining the nature or being of each thing according to the manner of its internal difference. This will be the method of intuition, what he says what he describes in that essay as the jouissance of difference. Although intuition as method is rarely referred to by name after Deleuze's publications on Bergson, the two impulses of the method certainly are, and those two are differentiation and integration. Now, on Deleuze's reading, the first impulse of intuition is the act of differentiation, a separating out of pure natures from a mixture, whereas the second impulse is an act of integration, in which a direction is followed to the end, converging on one and the same thing. If the former involves a separating or cutting out, such as the separating out of the colors red and yellow from within the color orange, the latter involves a rejoining or integration, following the lines of fact that converge to arrive at the thing orange. This method is to be distinguished from the common approach in science based on differences of degree and its spatializing method. And it's here that we reach more familiar Bergsonian terrain, the critique of spatialization. But it is explored by Deleuze from within the search for the nature of things. Things are normally understood in the sense of products or results. But when we think along these lines, Deleuze claims that, following Bergson, the difference between things will always be a difference of proportion and not a difference in nature. The same applies when it comes to the states or characteristics of things. And to this list, we could add predicates. For Deleuze's Bergson, what differs in nature are not things in the sense of results or their states, but rather their tendencies. The tendency to accentuate a characteristic rather than the actual characteristic. Now, what is the difference between these two? One way of answering this question is to say that it's the difference between, on the one hand, the thing as a product or result, and on the other hand, the process through which that thing is produced. In other words, it's the difference between identity determined through external opposition and individuation arising through internal differentiation and integration. But even this formulation does not go far enough, because a tendency is not only prior to the product as an end, it's also prior to the process that produces that end. It is prior to the cause of the end. If we were to ignore this dimension of tendencies, then simple differences of degree would be the correct status of things separated from the tendency and grasped in their elemental causes. That was Deleuze. When causes of things are considered apart from tendencies, such causes effectively belong to the domain of quantity. There's another crucial difference between things as products or results and the tendencies that constitute them. Tendencies are pure differences in nature, whereas things as products or results are always composites. They are mixtures of tendencies. How then can we ever arrive at pure tendencies? Deleuze says that we have no choice but to start from the composites, and this, in a certain sense, is the empiricism of Bergsonism. To quote Deleuze, we must use what the mixture presents to us, differences of degree or proportion, since nothing else is available to us. But we use them only as a measure of the tendency, in order to arrive at the tendency as the sufficient reason of the proportion. End quote. And with this sentence, we arrive at the first explicit reference to sufficient reason in this essay. The cause of a thing as product or result, when separated from tendency, is a difference of degree or proportion, a quantitative difference. But if we wish to arrive at the sufficient reason of a proportion, the sufficient reason of a thing as a product or result, we must seek those tendencies that in turn provide the sufficient reason of a thing. Whilst the being of things resides in their differences of nature, it turns out that the things in question are now tendencies. Deleuze says it is tendency that is the subject, end quote. To reach these tendencies, we need to start from the empirical experience of composites and attempt to divide them into their pure tendencies. The method for achieving this, Bergsonian intuition, is said by Deleuze to be more than a description of experience, but less than a transcendental analysis. It's more than a description of experience because, following Hume, neither the subject nor the given are presupposed as brute facts. But it's less than transcendental analysis because, in the method of intuition, the subject and the object are not separate, thus avoiding the anthropological error criticized by Deleuze in his Hippolyte review. The method, he says, certainly raises itself to the conditions of the given, but these conditions are tendency subjects. They are themselves given in a certain way. They are lived. That's a very important quote, we think, especially that last part. With this claim, we return most clearly to the problematic of Deleuze's Hume. How does the mind become this subject? It does so through the circumstances of this experience because it is the experience. And this brings us to one of the most important passages in Deleuze's earliest writings, if not in all of his writings. It's a long one, but it's also my personal favorite. So I have to read it out in full. Okay, it's great though. Here's what it says. We must not raise ourselves to the level of conditions as conditions of all possible experience, but as conditions of real experience. Schelling already gave himself the same and defined his philosophy as a superior empiricism. The formula suits Bergson just as well. If these conditions can and must be grasped in an intuition, it is precisely because they are the conditions of real experience, because they are no broader than the conditioned, because the concept they form is identical to its object. We should thus not be surprised to find in Bergson a kind of principle of sufficient reason, and of indiscernibles. What he refuses is a distribution which places reason in the genre or in the category, and which leaves the individual in the realm of the contingent, which is to say, in space. Reason must go right up to the individual, the true concept right up to the thing, comprehension to this. Why this rather than that? Bergson always poses this question of difference. End quote. Contra Kant, Deleuze cautions against conducting analysis from the perspective of the conditions of all possible experience, preferring instead to situate analysis from within the conditions of real experience. Only from this position can the concept and the object, or thought and being, be joined. The individual, moreover, does not supervene upon reason. On the contrary, it is only through individuation, the individuation of this rather than that the union of the concept and the thing is achieved. In this way, Bergson delivers for Deleuze a principle of sufficient reason that is capable of performing the task that his study of Hume, as well as his study of Hippolyte Hegel, called for: the creation of a conception of internal difference that can grasp the genesis of individuation from within the given to go beyond the given. Bergson is mentioned 6 times in his book on Hume, in Deleuze's book on Hume. Of these mentions, the most substantial reference pertains to this previous point. Hume's principles of association explain the form of thinking, but only, at best, the form of thinking in general, and not its particular contents. Deleuze then quotes a passage from Matter and Memory, where Bergson maintains that it's always possible to find a similarity between two ideas, no matter how dissimilar they are, if one generalizes or abstracts far enough, akin to the ways in which the imagination chaotically makes connections between ideas in Hume's indeterminate multiplicity, prior to it being rendered determinable by the principles of association. As Bergson writes, in language that evokes Hume directly, Bergson says, quote, "When we discover a relation of contiguity or of resemblance between two successive ideas, we have in no way explained why the one evokes the other. What we really need to discover is how a choice is affected among the infinite number of recollections, which all resemble in some way the present perception, and why only one of them, this rather than that, emerges into the light of consciousness." End quote. So that was Bergson. On Deleuze's reading, affect achieves what association cannot. Quote, "Only affectivity can justify the singular content, the profound and the particular." End quote. Deleuze argues that Hume is in agreement with Bergson. Indeed, he says Hume has never said anything else, insofar as, quote, "Circumstance gives the relation its sufficient reason, and this notion for him always refers to affectivity." End quote. As Deleuze concludes, quote, "Understood in this way, a set of circumstances always individuates a subject, since it represents a state of its passions and needs, an allocation of its interests, a distribution of its beliefs and exhilarations." End quote. These comments imply that Deleuze was already, in 1953, anticipating how a move to Bergson might enrich the discovery of a new principle of sufficient reason that can be discerned in his reading of Hume. But what, in the final analysis, is the Bergsonian account of difference in itself that is able to make good the principle of difference which Deleuze identifies in his reading of Hume? In the shorter essay that Deleuze wrote on Bergson, he had 2 essays published in 1956 on Bergson. I've been mostly talking about the longer one. But in the shorter one, Deleuze notes that if we are, he says, to discover the proper domain of philosophy, to attain the thing itself beyond the order of the possible, of causes and ends, we will need recourse to the triple form of Bergsonian difference in order to reconnect with the true reason of the thing in the process of being made, the philosophical reason that is not determination, but difference. End quote. Deleuze articulates these 3 distinct aspects of the conception of internal difference in the following way. quote, duration is difference with itself. Memory is the coexistence of degrees of difference, and the élan vital is the differentiation of difference. The first form that internal difference takes is in Bergson's philosophy is duration. The being of duration or real time is to change, which is why duration is what differs from itself, such that what differs has itself become a thing, a substance. But if the being of duration is to differ from itself, this means that its being includes that from which it differs, such that matter is the last nuance of duration. To explain this, Deleuze draws from Duration and Simultaneity, the book Duration and Simultaneity, the curious power of enveloping itself. And from Bergson's books Time and Free Will and Matter and Memory, he takes the idea of virtuality. His aim is to show us the process of differentiation at work, a process comprising the second form of internal difference, that being the élan vital. In Bergson's final book, which is the Two Sources of Morality and Religion, he extends this investigation of duration and the élan vital to the realms of humanity. Deleuze briefly touches on this in his long essay on Bergson, commenting on how, quote, with man and man alone, difference becomes conscious, raises itself to self-consciousness, end quote. But in doing so, he effectively uses this extension to circle back around to matter and memory, wherein lies the third form of internal difference. Quote, the consciousness of difference is memory. Memory must finally give us the nature of the pure concept of difference, end quote. Virtual memory gives duration an objective consistency. It makes of it a concrete universal, a term that he'll then use in difference repetition, which is realized through differentiation, the actualization of the élan vital's degrees of difference. The products of this process, quote, are objects which conform absolutely to the concept, at least in their purity, because in truth they are nothing other than the complementary position of different degrees of the concept itself, end quote. The union of the concept and the object, thought and being, is thus achieved via Bergson's triple form of internal difference. This method in conception of difference, moreover, yields the principle of sufficient reason and expression of individuation that Deleuze sought upon the conclusion of his book on Hume. As Deleuze writes in the final sentence of his essay Bergson's Conception of Difference, he says, the Bergsonian demand is to understand why the thing is this rather than something else. It is difference which explicates the thing itself and not its causes. Bergsonism is a philosophy of difference and of difference's realization. There we find difference in itself, and it realizes itself as novelty, end quote. Okay, I'll now wrap things up with the conclusion. In Deleuze's short essay on Bergson from 1956, he says that philosophy has a choice. It can content itself with being a functionary of science, providing critical reflection on the knowledge of things produced by science, or alternatively, it can seek, he says, quote, to establish or rather restore an other relationship to things, and therefore an other knowledge and a relationship that precisely science hides from us, of which it deprives us, because it allows us only to conclude and to infer without ever presenting, giving to us the thing in itself, end quote. By science, Deleuze here means critical philosophy, and Kant's critical philosophy in particular. As we know from Deleuze's review of Hippolyte's Logic and Existence, critical philosophy ultimately fails to bridge the gap between subject and object, thought and being. It fails to reach the being of things in themselves or deliver being to us. It's through Bergson that Deleuze finds the means to pursue the second path. Bergsonism affords us both the method as well as the three essential concepts that give it its meaning. But the story does not begin with Bergson. For Deleuze, it begins with Hume. He says at one point, quote, "The project we find in Bergson's work, that of reconnecting things by breaking with critical philosophy, was not absolutely new, even in France, because it defined a general conception of philosophy, and in many of its aspects participated in English empiricism." End quote. Even if Hume is largely left behind as Deleuze develops his philosophy of difference, it is through his work that the problematic context is inaugurated. Deleuze says at one point, quote, "The least we can say is that Hume thought of it first." Reprising this problematic context from Hume to Bergson is a useful exercise in several respects. Negatively, it provides, we think, a needed counterbalance to scholarship that takes its leave from Deleuze's work of the late 1960s. The supreme importance of Bergson for Deleuze has long been acknowledged, but perhaps still not as much as it should be. For it turns out that many aspects of Deleuze's philosophy that have been interpreted as emerging from his engagements with Leibniz and Spinoza, or Hume and Simondon, in fact have their genesis in the transition from Hume to Bergson. More substantially, by revealing the role of sufficient reason in Deleuze's early work, we gain an appreciation of why Deleuze is motivated to search beyond Hume and beyond Hippolyte Hegel for a method and a conception of difference in Bergson's philosophy. The search for a notion of difference in itself that is worthy of explicating individuation. Examining this work in its own problematic context and genesis allows us to discover how, for the early Deleuze, and this is a quote from Deleuze, "Sufficient reason is the reason of nuance and not of being. It is the reason of one thing rather than another, and not the reason of being rather than nothingness. This runs counter to Leibniz." End quote. On this basis, we would argue that Deleuze's subsequent work on the principle of sufficient reason, in the context of his readings of Leibniz and others, and most specifically in his book Difference and Repetition, is building on and enriching a problematic that is first articulated in the text that describe the move from Hume to Bergson. And that if we are to understand Deleuze's philosophy as a whole, as an attempt to express a new philosophy of difference, then the lineaments of this philosophy of difference are first established in the context of the problematic of sufficient reason, as it emerges in the move Deleuze makes from Hume to Bergson. And that's the end of the paper. Thanks.